A nyní přistoupíme k jedné přednášce, která bude online, protože přednášející je od nás poměrně dost daleko. Je teda v současné době v Americe a jeho přednáška je velmi zajímavá. Jmenuje se Biotechnologické plodiny pro mimozemské potravinové systémy. Ale než tu přednášku pustíme, nebo než se teda spojíme s přednášejícím, tak bych velmi ráda přivítala tady mezi náma pana doktora Grigara, který zřejmě slyšel Zdeňka Opatrného, jak o něm mluví a co spolu si říkají, takže mentiony, který tady jako poletují, tak ho asi přitáhli k nám a on teda přišel mezi nás, což je skvělé a já si myslím, že ho poprosím, aby potom, až odezní poslední přednáška, aby se zúčastnil nějaké té všeobecné diskuze, kterou tady chystáme a určitě přibydou i témata právě z té poslední přednášky. Já vás vítám, pane doktore. A já bych prosila teda, ano, už to tady máme, takže můžeme začít. Vidíme, jak se nám to podaří s tou technikou.
Excellent. Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I have to actually comment on the previous speakers. These have been really fascinating talks. The previous one, especially for me, because we've actually worked on these NGR and lazy proteins for many years. So it's really exciting to see these detailed mechanisms and how they work. And the family of genes, I think, are actually going to be really important for understanding how and developing ways to grow crops in space, especially given the challenges with gravity. So I'll talk a little bit about our work in this area, really on sort of the biotech side and engineering crops for these applications. So just to begin with, just so you're familiar, I'm with the United States Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Research Service. So we're the in-house research arm for the USDA. And we have some cooperative agreements with NASA to help develop food systems or technologies to grow food in space. And so pictured here is one of my cooperators. She works on microgreens. The work we do is mostly focused on fruit crops. So just to give you a little background, I wanted to start kind of giving you some idea of where things are going, at least in the United States, and what we see happening, and why we think we really have to put a lot of effort into developing food systems for space. So one of the first things is that commercialization of space has begun. This is something that it become multi-billion-dollar industries. There are companies developing launch vehicles for cargo and crew, manufacturing systems in space. Obviously, mining has been in the news a lot, the potential to mine, especially rare metals and minerals. The development of new space stations, which I'll mention a little more about. Tourism, which has become a big thing. And the idea of developing lunar ground installations is taking off, and those plans are in place. And also, long-term is mission to Mars, so that's still something at least the U.S. is very interested in accomplishing. And so these are just some of the companies involved, but this is a serious thing. And in terms of near-term plans, the International Space Station is due to be decommissioned in 2030. And it's going to be replaced by up to 4 commercial space stations. NASA also plans to build a base camp on the surface of the moon and a gateway station, which will be in lunar orbit. And those are going to begin next year. NASA has also awarded contracts to several companies to begin to extract and mine some lunar regolith. And then in space manufacturing, this is also a rapidly growing industry. So these are just some examples, I think, of what's happening in the sort of near term, and the real need that's being developed for farming systems that would be compatible with space flight. So I have this little video here, which I pulled from Buzz Lightyear, which kind of just makes you think about what food systems might look like.
You've missed 4 birthdays. Would you like a frosted snack cake to celebrate?
Negative. That would compromise my nutritional regimen.
We can talk about your feelings. I am an excellent listener.
No, look.
So obviously, that's not what we're after. Thinking about what people are going to eat in space, we have to really think about the potential to grow and produce food that's palatable and nutritious. So one of the big challenges is the cost. So getting food off of Earth, even to low Earth orbit, costs about $1,000 per pound, $50,000 if we want to go to the moon, and $500,000 to go to Mars. That's just per pound. So it's extremely expensive to supply and send food and water up to any crew or installation. One of the other important factors about growing plants has to do with mental well-being. So having access to fresh food and vegetables is really critical to long-term mental well-being and psychology of people living in those pretty harsh conditions. There's also the advantages, obviously, of and efficiencies of circular biosystems. So plants utilizing carbon dioxide and producing oxygen obviously has some obvious benefits. There's also been a lot of work lately on understanding some of the stability and availability of vitamins and some essential nutrients. And we know that some of these aren't that stable. So it's not like you can just take vitamins with you and that sort of thing, that some will need to be produced in space. So over the past decades, there's been a lot of research already with growing plants in space. And these have been done largely as sort of proof of concept or very experimental projects. So this is just a list of some of the things that have been grown. So from herbs to vegetables like cucumbers and peppers, a lot of leafy greens, even some cereal crops like rice and wheat, and tubers like onions and potato. So these experiments have had sort of mixed success, but they've shown you can grow plants, and they do grow somewhat normally. Obviously, the lack of gravity is an issue, but they're edible, and you can produce them. The question is, what can we produce, how much of it, and can we actually develop a food system? Right now, there's really been 2 main growing systems on the International Space Station. So one, which was referred to earlier, is called Veggie. This is a more simplified system, and this is shown on the top. And then the more advanced one is the Advanced Plant Habitat, shown on the lower right. And there you can see this is a fully enclosed system where the atmosphere is controlled, and really every aspect of the environment that the plants are growing in. The other thing I should mention too, which is really fueling a lot of progress and development in this area, is the rise of controlled environment agriculture, so also called indoor farming. So these indoor farming systems and companies are rapidly expanding. They're investing millions and millions of dollars into producing food in controlled environments and expanding our understanding of how to do this and how to maximize food production when you do have complete control over the environment. So there's some real opportunities there and a lot of new technologies that are being developed. And a lot of this work is being focused around genetics. And so I'll talk more about that. But in terms of the actual challenges that we face in space or in extraterrestrial environments, they're much more severe than just what we're dealing with in terms of indoor farming. Obviously, microgravity environments, which you've heard a bit about. The other issue is soil-free growing systems that are required for this. All growing systems must be compact and very space efficient. They have to be compatible with other life support systems. Obviously, have to be highly efficient in their use of water and nutrients. The importance of what we call precision nutrition. This is having a set of crops that provide sort of maximal health benefits, and also potentially offset other health issues. These are closed systems, so you have challenges such as volatile accumulation. They must be circular, so reutilization of the water, nutrients, and any inedible biomass. For food storage, you have to have high productivity, shelf life for whatever you're producing potentially. The growing system must be reliable, since it's absolutely going to be required and dependable. And then the food you're producing needs to be palatable, again, for the mental well-being of the astronauts or those eating the food. And just to kind of highlight some of the production challenges, so one of the main issues is hypoxia and the inability to use sort of standard soils. So fluids behave very different in low gravity. And there's on the upper right, I just saw a picture of one of the astronauts with water on his hand. So water tends to stick to surfaces, and on roots, if it will stick to them. And as soon as the oxygen's absorbed, they'll become hypoxic and it'll cause damage. So they've had to develop some novel sort of growing media in order to make water available to the roots without causing hypoxia. So this is a big challenge. I mentioned accumulation of volatiles, so ethylene can be a big issue depending on what you're growing, and potentially other volatiles that could lead to sort of detrimental effects on the plants. Simply how we're propagating the plants. So are they going to be grown from seeds, or as in the case of many fruit crops, they're grown vegetatively from cuttings. So how are you going to do that? Obviously, plant health and diseases and what things they might face, we don't know much about. Air movement and things like that, the evapotranspiration, the efficiency of photosynthesis, those are all open questions and potential challenges. And then the other one is gravitropism and plant development, which we just heard a lot about in that great talk. What I'm showing here in the lower right-hand side is a plum tree that we engineered to knock out one of the lazy genes, which are sort of the shoot counterparts to the NGR proteins. And we get these sort of weeping or low-growing trees where the shoots grow sideways or downward. But in some of those, we're also seeing some chlorosis and potential problems. So we have questions about whether the gravitropism is important, perhaps, in the development or photosynthesis or some aspect of the plant growth. So these are all issues that are going to require a lot of research and development in order to iron out. So when you think about sort of food systems and what we can grow in space, most of it's focused so far on sort of vegetative or small crops, fruit or vegetable and leafy greens. And one area that we've been focused on is the potential for production of fruit crops. So most of our fruit crops either grow on trees or plants that are seasonal. They're temperate, they have dormancy periods, things like that. They're not necessarily compatible with sort of what you might think of in a space or extraterrestrial growing system. And so these limitations are largely genetic, so they tend to be more slow growing. Obviously, they're large. They have more complex environmental requirements, such as dormancy, seasonal cropping. So if you're in a space flight scenario, you don't want the food coming once a year. So you need to have some kind of continual production or regular production. Again, they're vegetatively propagated. They're not grown from seed. in order to maintain the quality. And then some fruits do not store well, so essentially they would have to be consumed within a very short period of time of their production. So our focus of our work has really been on devising ways we can potentially use biotechnology to overcome these limitations and engineer crops specifically for these specialized and growing environments. So this could apply both to space flight as well as indoor agriculture, which I mentioned earlier. So because of all of the research that's been done over the years on plant development and flowering and life cycles, we actually know a lot of the gene targets to alter things like flowering and dormancy and growth. And so there are potentially existing knowledge that can be used to rationally sort of design or engineer crops for these specific applications. Obviously, there's still a lot that we need to learn, but there's at least enough information that we can begin to sort of try to design and develop some of these crops. So one of the things that I've worked on for the past decade or so is genes related to plant shape. Like I mentioned, lazy. This is another one we call weep. And this gene also is a gravity regulator. And so we can use that to reduce or alter the shape of the plant or the way it grows. This obviously wouldn't necessarily apply in a microgravity situation, but there are other genes too that we've been worked on. Again, many of the plant shape regulators seem to be gravity related. So when you grow in the absence of gravity, you won't accomplish that. This particular gene we call TAC1. This actually is a negative, we believe it's a negative regulator of lazy and the NGR proteins. So it has the opposite effect when you knock it out. They grow vertically instead of horizontally. Some of the other genes we've worked on, this is to control tree size. So this is a dwarfing gene, GID1, it's a GA receptor. And we showed that in plum trees, you can actually, if you reduce the expression using RNAi technology, you can actually sort of modulate the tree height and the internode distances. And so this is something that we've been wanting to do to try to reduce tree size. So from a lot of the work we've done, we've sort of settled on some initial crops that we want to test. And so we call these candidate sort of biotech crops. And I'm going to talk about these. We're just beginning to really try to apply these to space flight and work with them. The first one I'll focus on is tomatoes. So these are from Cold Spring Harbor, and I'll describe them a little more, but Zachary Lippman, our cooperator, developed those. And then we have plums and apples. So two orchard crops that you normally would not probably consider compatible with space flight or for those kinds of systems, but modifying just one or a small number of genes, you can potentially re-engineer these to make them compatible. So the system that we're working with is what we call environmental test chamber systems. So these were built for us by NASA, and they have a handful of these as well. They're sort of simplified versions of the advanced plant habitat that's on the ISS. They are still closed systems, so the air is recycled, and we can control and monitor CO2, humidity, light intensity and spectrum, that sort of thing, monitor photosynthesis. And we use these in clean conditions. So we're using soil-free systems to grow the plants, or modified soil systems, I should say. So this is what our chambers look like. You can see they're clear, and I'll explain why that is in a minute, but they're relatively small. And so our goal is to just initially figure out how to grow plants in these, what challenges will be, optimize the conditions, and then start trying to really make some determinations about using sort of the latest technology and plants that are fruit crops that are sort of accelerated in their growth and development. How much food can we actually produce in a given amount of space over some unit time. So those are the kinds of questions that we need to answer in order to figure out what a farming system or food system, what the requirements might be. So I mentioned they're clear. It's because we actually have these in a lab in Walt Disney World at Epcot Center in Florida. And these are on display for visitors. So we're doing the research in the lab. We have a cooperative agreement with Disney, and we do research in the lab, and it's kind of on display for people to see at the park. So this is just an image showing one of our scientists, Mark Sperry, who's in the picture along with our NASA colleagues in front of the window there. So to start with the tomatoes, so this was published a few years ago by Zach Littman, and their idea with these was to really dramatically alter the tomato growth and development using gene editing. So they targeted 3 mutations. So one of them converts the plant from an indeterminate growth state to determinate. So the shoots will terminate with flowers and fruits. This makes them a little smaller. He also targeted SB5G mutation, which leads to earlier flowering and makes the plants more compact. And then finally, the third mutation reduces internode distances. So collectively, the 3 of them we refer to as triple determinant. And these plants grow very small, they flower quickly, and they produce, they have a much higher harvest index, meaning that there's a lot more fruit to leaf and stem biomass. So this is obviously desirable for spaceflight conditions. So we just got these, we just started working with them. And this is just a picture of what they look like in our chambers. Couple of things we noted initially was that the growth wasn't as compact as we expected. This is probably, we believe, due to light intensity or perhaps our light cycle that we were using. They did grow and without really doing anything to them. So we were trying to do this in sort of an automated way where we wouldn't have to have much hands or maintenance of the plants. So we didn't do any pollination. We did still get some decent fruit set. However, we did see what we believe is sort of ethylene-induced epinasty. We used sort of a system to remove ethylene, but it doesn't seem to be that it wasn't completely efficient. So we probably need to improve that. But at least it was a first demonstration that we can potentially grow a significant amount of fruit using these triple determinant tomatoes. So we're currently working on these to develop essentially plans and protocols for future spaceflight experiments. So the other one I had mentioned were these continual flowering plums. So these we developed a number of years ago by overexpressing a gene called flowering locust T, or FT1, from birch. And overexpressing this results in trees that are very small. They flower continuously. They don't seem to have a dormancy requirement, which was sort of interesting. And we can get fruit to set year round. As you can see in the picture, we can have fully mature, developed ripe fruits along with immature fruit and even flowers all in the same plant. We did find that we can manipulate the flowering with temperature. So at higher temperatures, they'll grow vegetatively. And if we reduce the temperatures to sort of spring-like temperatures, it'll induce flowering. So that gives us the ability to sort of cycle or crop them if we want to. The other nice thing about plums in particular is that dried plums or prunes are known to have this really nice property where they can limit or minimize osteoporosis. So bone loss in low gravity environments is a big problem. So this is a fruit crop that would potentially have some nutraceutical benefits in addition to just nutritional. And the third one I'd mentioned are apples. So we have a couple different engineered apples that we're working with. So one is these were originally developed by Flakowski at the Julius Kuhn Institute. And these are overexpressing BPMADS4, which, if you're familiar with these genes, is related to fruitful. And it stimulates eliminates the juvenility period for apple. They'll flower fairly quickly, and they have a cycle of roughly 1 to 1.5 years. So on the picture on the left, what I'm showing, we actually use these trees for what we call rapid cycle breeding. So we can accelerate the breeding process by using these sort of biotech early flowering lines to short circuit the juvenility period and accelerate breeding cycles. But we've also found that we can actually grow them and produce a significant amount of fruit. So this was one that we were interested in. The challenge with these, though, is they tended to still be quite large, and their flowering cycles were a little slow. So we've been trying to some other genes to try to get something that might be more compatible with space flight. And so the one we've tried most recently is to silence a gene called TFL, which is a negative regulator of FT. And with these, we found that we can get much stronger flowering phenotypes. So we can get plants that are very small. And even in these small plants, we found they can set fruit. In fact, they were parthenocarpic, meaning that they were setting fruit without pollination, which is, for spaceflight, would be really ideal. Many fruit crops are not self-compatible, so they would require pollination. So having something that would either be self-compatible or wouldn't require pollination at all would be ideal. So what we found in general is that you can use sort of biotechnology to re-engineer these crops that you normally would think would be recalcitrant or not compatible with such systems. But the genetic constraints can be overcome, and they can be overcome with relatively small number of changes. And so there's still a lot we have to learn about how we can do this in different food crops, what species we can actually engineer. So in addition to the 3 that I mentioned, we're also working on developing systems for grape and cherry. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in understanding the growth conditions and how to horticulturally and agriculturally manipulate these to get significant food production. And then also, obviously, getting the information we need to prepare for spaceflight experiments, as actually doing this in microgravity environments will be really critical to understanding and confirming exactly whether or not we can produce these kinds of foods in spaceflight. So that I'll stop and just acknowledgement slide of our cooperators here at the USDA, at Kennedy Space Center, and Cold Spring Harbor. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions.